Today we're going to talk about trust currency. And as I mentioned in the previous video, trust currency is the combination of trust on one side and obviously currency on the other side. And as you might recall in your studies as well, what we're going to talk about is really if we have a high level of trust, the transactional cost in any relationship will be low and the profit for everybody involved will be pretty high. On the other hand, if we have a low level of trust, our transactional cost will go up and the profit for everybody involved will be lower. Now imagine this for a second. You're a procurement officer in a major corporation and you're in charge of buying, for instance, a plastic cup like this. Huge responsibility, obviously. You're buying thousands or even millions of these cups every single year. And you've been working with this supplier for many, many years. You're very happy with him. He has always fulfilled everything he's promised. The price has been good and you're really, really happy. You have the same sense of humor. You have a great communication. Everything is working out perfectly. But suddenly a new thing happens on the market. A new supplier pops up, and as you can see, he's offering the exact same cup. Same quality, same color, same everything. It is a completely identical cup. The only challenge for you is that this new supplier, you don't really like him. You get this weird stomach sensation that something is wrong. You can't put your finger on what it might be, but you might have that experience in real life as well. You step into a conference room, you see somebody, you never talked to them before, you never heard about them before, you actually never met them before, but you get that stomach sensation that you don't really like them. You don't know why or how, but that's just the sensation you get. That's the feeling you're getting with this new supplier. But your challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is this new supplier is 1% cheaper than the previous one you've been working with for years. What are you going to do? Are you going to continue your relationship with the new supplier, even though you don't like him and don't trust him, but he's still 1% cheaper? Or are you continuing with the old one that you like and you trust that is 1% higher priced than the new one coming on board? Now, some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, I would go back to the old supplier and start renegotiating, telling him there's another supplier in the market that can actually offer the same cup at a lower price. And that's a great idea, but let's just assume for a second that the old supplier is telling you, honestly, that that's the best price he can give you. It can't get any better than that. So my big question to you, ladies and gentlemen, is how many of you would stay with the old supplier you like and you trust that is 1% higher priced? And how many of you would go with the new lower priced one that you don't like and you don't trust? My experience is that the majority of all people I talk to regarding this simple example will go with the existing one. And what I typically do is then I increase the price difference, so let's say 3%. Just feel again in your stomach, how many of you would now switch and go with the new one that is 3% lower priced? And how many of you would still stay with the old one? Let's say price difference is 6%. Again, same question, how many of you would switch to the new one? How many would stay with the old one? And let's go all the way up to 25%. I'm absolutely certain right now that the majority of all of you would now go with the new one. Because if it's 25 or 30 or above 30%, you would feel that the price difference is now so big, so you're willing to take the risk, you're willing to gamble, and you're willing to try and go with this new supplier. But think about what I'm just telling you right now. This is just a very simple, stupid product like a plastic cup. And you know what's kind of interesting? We have found in our studies that we accept up to 34% price difference just based on the concept of trust and likability. So it's not even a question about the product or the price or the supplier itself, but just the feeling about the person we're sitting in front of. So what we're going to talk about today is really the concept of trust currency and why the concept of trust is so crucial in relationship to a successful negotiation, and why it's so important for you to understand how important it is, for you to be perceived as a trustworthy person, and how important it is for you to trust other people. Now, Now, an American professor by the name of Yankelovich have written a wonderful book that I recommend you guys to read if you want to, called Profit with Honor. And what Yankelovich, he actually been studying is the concept of motivation versus complexity. And I'm getting back to in a second why that is very much related to trust. What this professor is actually claiming is the following, that the complexity in jobs has been increased with approximately 50% in the last 20 years. Think about that. So if you're an attorney, if you are a technician, if you're an accountant, if you're an engineer, if you're any kind of work, education or any kind of job, your content of the job and the complexity in the job has increased with about 50% in the last 20 years. So that basically means that the complexity has increased. The job is more complex, it's more difficult to handle today than it was 20 years ago. Okay? That's one statement. The other statement is actually the scary one, because at the same time, our professor is claiming that the motivation has dropped with approximately 10%. So what he's claiming in his book is actually that the complexity in the job has increased with 20% in the last 20 years, with 50% in the last 20 years, but motivation has actually dropped with 10%. So that means we are less motivated today dealing with a more complex job than ever before. Now that gap that we're getting in between the complexity and the motivation is actually a thing that will decrease trust and increase the complexity of doing any kind of business deal. I often meet clients who come to me and tell me that negotiations are very complicated, and they're even more complicated today than ever before. And I very often disagree. I very often tell them, no, do you know what, sir? What I find is that the actual content of negotiation is at the absolutely same level as it was 20 years ago. What makes negotiation more complicated today is basically people. Now, as you might recall, we did a study together with World Economic Forum where we were looking at the trust level around the world, and that was based on the book I published, and it was based on my feeling that trust actually had dropped in the world. And what I find is a tiny bit scary is that you can see the trust level we have based on the World Economic Forum study. What they claim is that you look at the graphical bar up here is that the longer this bar is, the higher level of trust we have towards that organization, and the shorter the bar might be, the lower level of trust we have towards that organization. I don't know whether when you look at this graphics up here, whether some of you are surprised thinking, hey, that's an enormous low trust we have towards parliaments and governments, and it's a surprising big amount of trust we have towards the defense organizations. I was honestly surprised myself when I saw this study for the first time. And what I thought was kind of interesting, especially if you look at NGOs, non-governmental organizations, their trust levels actually measured quite high. What is that telling us? And what is it that the defense organizations, like the Army obviously, and NGOs has in common, versus if we look at multinational companies or people in politics? Think about that for a second. Imagine that you are watching BBC, CNN, Fox News, whatever, and you are seeing the CEO of, let's say, BP or Shell, oil company, sitting being interviewed in a dialogue, and across the table is the president of Greenpeace sitting. Do you know what is very interesting? The majority of the viewers out there in the world will trust the president of Greenpeace way more than they would trust the head of the multinational company. And the reason is, back to my original question 3 seconds ago, the reason is that a lot of people believe that the NGO doesn't have a hidden agenda. They are not in there for the profit. But a lot of people believe that the multinational or the person in politics have a hidden agenda. They have something they want to achieve. They need to get a profit, they need to get a revenue, they need to get an outcome, where the majority of people being asked believe that the NGO are in there with a better and higher purpose. But then again, on the other hand, the NGO needs money in as well to run, don't they? They need people to share, they need charities funding, they need money as well. So their interest could be just at the same level as any other organization. But it's just interesting when we're talking about measuring trust at different organization level. When we talk about negotiation and trust, and we talk especially about the strategy approach that I mentioned in another video, what we basically have when we're looking at the three different negotiation approaches is the following. And pay attention to what I'm telling you now, because you're going to need that in one of your studies. What we're seeing in a typical zero-sum negotiation is obviously we have an information level. This is what you see on that line that just popped up on the screen. And on the horizontal line, we have the trust level. If we look at a zero-sum negotiation, information level is pretty low and trust level is definitely low. So this is what we call one against one negotiation. If we move into a different kind of negotiation, that could be a partnership, or it could be any kind of developed above zero-sum negotiation approach, what we're going to see is that the information level is increasing. People are simply sharing more information at this point. And as an outcome, or because of that, we even see that the trust level is increasing as well. So obviously in partnership, we have way more information and more trust than we would in a zero-sum. So what we are seeing in a partnership is what we call two acting as two, but the limitation in partnership is they're still not agreed on rules of the game, how to negotiate, and they may not have agreed either on how to split the concept of necroeconomics. If you look at the third level, smartnership. In smartnership level, obviously information exchange is way higher than zero-sum, and the trust level have been discussed and agreed and are way above zero-sum and is above partnership as well. So in a smartnership solution, the parties have agreed both on trust, on information sharing. They've also agreed on rules of the game, and they have discussed on how to utilize the potential necroeconomics and how to create a split if that necroeconomic sum is actually identified. Okay? The third one, or the fourth one, sorry, that we got here, it's basically something else, because that is if we move into a joint venture or if we even do a merger acquisition, and that is something different than these three negotiation approaches that we're talking in these days. So I basically very often compare smartnership to being engaged, and a joint venture obviously is like marriage. So in smartnership, obviously you're still in a very competitive situation. You should still be looking around. You should still be focusing on comparing the counterpart you're negotiating with. You're not isolated to that party, so it's not a monopoly. If you move into a joint venture, merger acquisition, obviously, that is the counterpart that you are supposed to continue relationship with. Right. Now, when we are talking about trusts, I'm very curious about the Roman Empire, because that was basically very impressive what the engineers were able to do thousands of years before we have modern engineering art coming out right now. And if you go to Rome, Italy, you'll see that they have created masterpieces and buildings that are still there today. So that means that buildings that was built more than 2,000 years ago are still standing. And they can even do, as you can see, wonderful, wonderful setups and engineering art that we forgot in the meantime and have been recreated after that period. And one of the things that really interests me is the arch. If we look at the architectural arch, what the Romans figured out very early on is that we have the keystone. And if you look at typical Roman arch like this, the keystone is the single thing that keeps the whole arch standing. That means if you remove that keystone, the whole arch will fall apart. If any of you have been traveling the countryside of England, I certainly recommend that you visit some of the wonderful, beautiful villages you find outside of London. And one of them, actually named one of the most beautiful villages in England, is called Castle Combe. If anyone go to Castle Combe, I certainly hope that you will find what I found when I went to Castle Combe a couple of years ago. There was actually a private house that was selling cakes. And what you see on this stand out here is a cake stand that is actually selling cakes. And I was very curious. I was walking up to the door. On the sign on the door, as you can see, it just says, "This business is based on trust. Pick a cake and just leave the money out here." There was nobody to serve you. There was nobody to help you. Everything was based on trust. Now, since I'm a researcher and I'm very curious about our relationship, behavioral economics, and all of this, I just have to figure out something else. So I knocked at the door, and a small, tiny older woman came out, and I kind of started interviewing her because I said, this is a wonderful business concept you got. So you don't actually know if people are just stealing the cake and not paying you, or whether they're leaving to less, they're not paying enough for the cake. And she looked absolutely confused at me and said, no, do you know what's kind of funny? I actually generally make a bigger revenue than the cake should actually give me, because people have a tendency to pay more than I'm actually asking for the cake. And I said, really? Why is that? She said, well, if people don't have the right amount of money, they simply leave more. They very rarely leave less. So what is really interesting to me is that all her business, their entire business is based on trust. And she was actually making a profit out of trusting people. She was making more money out of that than if she was actually standing there with her own box of money so she could actually give back if people were paying her too much. Back to the dear Professor Jankulovic. What he's also saying is basically that we are in a situation that is pretty bad compared to the last 20 years. If you relate this to the World Economic Forum study, that basically says the same thing, that we are at the lowest level of trust as long as we've been measuring trust in the Western world. Now look at this graph we have on the screen right now and think about if that looks something related to something completely different that we could measure. What this graph is actually telling us is that the trust level in the Western world was pretty high in the 50s, then it dropped in the 70s, had a slight increase in the 80s and 90s, then it dropped again in the early 90s, it had an increase in the late 90s, and then obviously, as you can see, it has dropped today to the lowest level ever recorded as long as we've been measuring trust. If you take this graph and put that on top of a graph that is showing the financial economical development in the Western world, they are actually kind of similar. Isn't that interesting? We saw in the 70s there was an oil crisis going on in the Western world, and the financial system dropped based on that. Then we had an increase and a drop, and an increase again when we have the golden times, just before the crisis hit us, and then the crisis came and we had a drop. Now I got a chicken and the egg question for all of you, and that is, do we have a high level of trust when we are financially successful, or are we financially successful because we have a high level of trust? That was question one. Question two is, do we have a low level of trust because we are unsuccessful financially, or are we unsuccessful financially because we have a low level of trust? The terrible thing is, I can't answer that question myself. I really don't know. But what I can just conclude is that those two mechanisms are very tight connected. I have a few questions that I would like to ask you, and obviously you don't have to answer them because I'm bringing out an answer as well, but I'm just going to show you the outcome, and this is a study we did among 5,500 executives around the world. And one question is here: if I believe my boss is doing something wrong internally in the company, would I then approach him or her about that incident and about what I felt that he or she was doing wrong? Think about this question for yourself for a second. So if you were working in a company, your boss were doing something that was unethical, wrong, or even illegal, would you approach the person about it? Now the response rate we got here was actually the following, and that is 46% said they would never or rarely approach their boss about if they felt that he or she was doing something wrong. To me, that was a bit scary. That was a pretty high number in my world. Second question we were asking a lot of these people is, if I knew my company was involved in something unethical or illegal, would I then report it to the relevant authorities even though it could have a negative impact on my job? Again, think about this question yourself. If you're working in a company and you know that your company is doing something illegal or unethical, would you actually report it to external authorities with the potential consequence that you could lose your job? Again, we were asking 5,500 executives about this, and what we learned based on this question was the following. 44% said rarely or never. Again, to be honest, I was kind of surprised about how high this number actually came out. The third question we were also asking these 5,500 executives was this one, and I personally found this to be quite funny. Because we were, for instance, asking them a question up here saying, have you ever employed people without paying taxes for having these people employed? So that means, would you have illegal immigrants employed? Would you have somebody employed where you wouldn't report the income tax or whatever? And what we learned was that about 75% of all these executives globally said, yeah, I've been doing this at one point or another in my life. Second question was, have you ever avoided reporting income tax to the tax authorities? 42.4% said yes. So that means that you had some income where you should, in theory, report it in order to do things right. But as you can see, 42% actually said, yeah, I had income, but I didn't report it. And then we had a kind of a funny question throwing in there, but that has something to do with honesty and ethics as well, obviously. And that is, have you ever been unfaithful to your spouse? And I have to say, all of these 5,500 people could respond to this without giving in their name. So we believe they were kind of honest. So 37% said, yes, I've actually been unfaithful to my spouse. Have you ever taken products in a store without paying? Now we could translate that into stealing because that is actually what it is. And the question was actually a bit longer because we also added in your adult life. So we were not only talking about when you were 6 years old and by accident grabbed some candy in a store. We are actually asking these 5,500 executives in their adult life if they've actually taken something. And 19% of them said, yes, I have been stealing something in a store. That's actually 1 out of 5 that admits that they might have been stealing something in their adulthood. Have you ever lied at a job interview? That's 17% that says, yes, I've been doing that in order to get the job. And then this one is actually interesting because that basically gives prison in most countries, and that is, would you use insider information if you would gain a profit from that insider information? So that basically means if you know something that will give you a bonus or an advantage in relation to investing in shares, would you do that? And 11% said, yes, I would actually do that. In my native country, Denmark, that actually gives you 6 years in jail if it's proven that you've been abusing inside information on the stock market. Have you ever cheated at an exam? 9.5% said yes. And I can add another small story to that. At Copenhagen University in Denmark, we did this study among the doctors who were educating themselves to become surgeons as well. And we were asking them, again without they have to report their name, if any of them had ever cheated at the exam. 63% came back and said, yes, I have cheated at the exam. Because the amount of data that we have to study and memorize is so huge, so I just have to cheat, otherwise I can't pass that exam. Could you imagine that you're lying there at the hospital, you're ready for the whole operation, and you're just hoping that the surgeon coming in, he actually passed the exam and he did it in a legal way, so he actually knows what he's about to do? That's kind of a funny dash scary thought as well. And the last one, I laughed a lot when I saw this the first time. That is, have you ever used physical violence towards one of your employees? And we're talking about white-collar employees, so people in an office. And we actually got a response here of 7.4%. Surprising, isn't it? 7.4% actually says, yes, I have been using physical violence towards my employees. Now you could ask yourself, if you're a manager, have you ever felt like you wanted to be violent towards an employee? Or have you ever done it? It's very rare I meet somebody who said, I actually been violent, but I do meet managers who says, yes, I would actually like it at one point. Ask yourself this question as well. Is your moral better than your colleagues? Interesting question, isn't it? We were actually asking this question to a huge amount of students at a very known and recognized university in Europe. And what was kind of interesting was that 10.4% said, no, I have a worse moral than most of my colleagues, most of the other students at this university. But what was really funny in this case was that 82.3% actually said, no, I have a better moral than the majority of all the students at this university. Now, there's something mathematical that is kind of wrong, isn't it? Because 82.3 can't possibly have a better moral because it doesn't make sense. And that just tells us that in general we have this tendency to overrate or overestimate our own moral and ethics. We did another study at a university once, just for fun, where we were asking a group of executive MBA students in a class of 50 people, how many of them that found that they were more clever or brighter than the other students in class. I don't know if you can guess what the outcome was, but we got a response rate of 100%. So 100% of all the students found that they were brighter and more skilled than the rest of the students in the class. Kind of funny doing studies like that. Not very useful, but just kind of fun to tell all of us that we kind of think that we might be a little bit better than we actually are. I got this small thing for you where I want you to test your trust, and that is basically a small survey that I would like you to do while you're watching this video. So listen carefully and just grab a pen, a piece of paper, an iPad or computer, and just write down what your immediate response might be. And it's basically just a yes/no question. So the first one is, from 1 to 10, do you go into a new relation with a level of trust below 5? Yes or no? Do you go into a new relationship with a trust level below 5? And the next question would be, must a friend or colleague earn your trust? Do they have to do something to gain your trust? Yes or no? Third one, if your intuition tells you that you can trust a person, do you then ignore this feeling? Yes or no? Do you have the need to be in control over yourself? Yes or no? Do you have the need to be in control over your surroundings? Yes or no? Do you avoid demanding things because you tell yourself, I can't do this? Yes or no? Are you defensive when somebody criticizes you? Yes or no? If someone presents an alternative point of view than your own, do you then tend to agree with them? Yes or no? Do you prefer friends for their exterior rather than what you feel for them, like naturally? Yes or no? And the last one is, if someone accuses you of something, do you have a tendency to feel guilty even though you are not? Yes or no? Now, if you have a majority of yeses on this very, very simple quiz, then there is a risk that you might have difficulties with trust toward other people. If obviously the opposite goes, that you have a majority of no, then there is a potential that you have an easier access creating and maintaining trust towards other people. But the MCI score that all of you are going to do will actually tell you a lot more about that when you work out and work with that MCI in more details. Another one I would like you to do is test the trust of others. And if you take question number 1 up here, do people open up to you and tell you things which they don't tell others? Yes or no? Same question. Are you generally tolerant and not judging others? Yes or no? Do people offer you help and support without you asking for it? Yes or no? So you're sitting in the office and a colleague comes by and said, hey, Maria, can I help you with something? Yes or no? Do people seek your advice? Yes or no? And do you admit when you've made a mistake? Yes or no? If you go to question 6, do you have a tendency of being sarcastic and using disparaging comment about other people? Yes or no? Do you badmouth others or pass on rumors? Yes or no? Do you tell lies if it gives you an advantage? Yes or no? Do you lie if it gives you an advantage? Yes or no? Do you try to present yourself in a positive light even though that it's at somebody else's cost? Yes or no? And the last one, do you take responsibility for things somebody else did? The same thing goes, if you have a lot of yeses in the question 1 to 6, there's definitely a potential that other people trust you and like you. They come to you automatically. If you have a majority of yeses on question 6 till 11, there's definitely a risk that you potentially don't generate a lot of trust from other people. Now, obviously, I encourage you to be as honest as possible when you are doing these quizzes and when you're doing the MCI as well, because the only one you're really cheating by trying to overrate whatever the answer might be, would basically be yourself. So try and be as honest as possible. A year ago, I did a study together with the Honest Tea Corporation, and that is an amazing company based on the East Coast in the US. What they're doing is obviously they're producing a drink, it's a tea, but they are focused on being very transparent, they are focused on being very honest, so they use fair trade and they are very fair in all their activities and engagement and relationship with suppliers and customers and employees and everybody. And they've actually for some years now done a fun exercise in the US where they've been going to 20, 25, 30 different cities around the US and been setting up something like you see on the screen right now. So basically what they're doing is they're setting up a box of their drinks. They have a poster saying that it's $1 and it's based on an honor system. And as you can see, there's a box, a glass box where you insert your dollar, and that's really it. And nobody is actually there on the stand. Nobody's staffing it. Nobody is actually watching purposely. that the customer pays or not pay. So it's basically the honest system. The customer have to decide themselves whether they will just take the bottle without paying, or they actually want to take the bottle and go up and pay the $1. Now, what the Honest Company, Honest Tea, have been doing during these years with this study is they have 1 or 2 people that are sitting far away, so the potential customers or people approaching this stand don't know they're there. And they're just sitting making a count of who's actually paying and who's not paying. And what is really interesting and what is surprising to a lot of people is that the average trust level is 94%. So that means out of these 15,000 to 20,000 people that go through this study and survey every single year, 94% of all of them are actually paying. Only 6% is actually picking up a bottle and then taking off and leaving. Now, what is even more interesting in a lot of these cases is that the Honest system actually generates more cash and more money that they would have gained by just selling each bottle. Back to Castle Comp in England, because the same thing happens. Some of the customers don't only have $1, they might only have a $5 note, so they throw in the $5 and perhaps pick up only 3 bottles. So what is happening as an outcome is that we generate more money based on the Honest system than actually having people employed standing there just to control and check that everybody is paying. Now, if you actually convert this very simple example, obviously, to real life, you could even add the factor that you're saving staff standing there, you're saving that you have to have control system and surveillance and whatever. And a small fun add-on I can tell you is that when they were setting up this system and this stand in an airport, the Honest response was 100%. So that means nobody was taking a bottle at the airport, everybody was paying. I don't know what happened. I can't answer that question. What the difference might be within an airport or outside an airport. It might be the whole thing with security and whatever, that we feel that we are just supposed to be more honest than we would be otherwise. All right, I have a few slides left on this video, and then I encourage you to do your exercise that we're going to talk about. And one of the things that is kind of funny is that obviously we see people differently based on where we're coming from. So we just can't describe Germans in one way, or French in another way, or English in a third way, because it's all based on where we look. So that means perception depends on who's looking. And I have a small questionnaire for you. We have a group A and a group B, and that is 2 different nationalities that are looking towards the US. So we asked that group A and group B people to look at Americans, look at the US, and then describe how they see Americans. And obviously we generalize, but they were asked to describe Americans how they actually saw them. And group A's perception of the US was as following. They say the Americans are easygoing, they're very emotional, they're relaxed, they are very talkative, they have a great sense of humor, they're focused on material success, and they're very creative. So that was Group A perception idea about the US. Then we were asking Group B. And Group B, looking at the US, said the following. They are hardworking. It's kind of different than just easygoing, right? Group B said they don't show feelings. Very opposite to what Group A said. But they claim the Americans are very emotional. Then they said that the Americans are very time conscious. Again, very opposite to the Group A, saying they're very relaxed. They're very reserved, Group B is saying. They are serious, they're focused on material success, and they have no idea about how to design products. Now, the only single thing that was in common between Group A's perception of the US and Group B's perception of the US was material success. All the other ones were completely different. Now, I have to ask you, take a second now. Stop the video for a second if you need to, and then look at who do you think, what nationality was Group A, and what nationality do you think Group B might be? Now the answer, obviously, I'm going to give that to you, and Group A, if you look at them, they were the Japanese. The Japanese looked at the US in that way, that was their perception of the US, and Group B was Italians. Italians look at the US completely different. The reason I'm sharing this short story we did here is basically just to give you an idea that our understanding of other people is so much based on where we're coming from, our values, our understanding. So that means how we view the world will definitely have an impact on how we read other people. Sometimes I meet negotiators who come to me and say, I do like your whole concept of smartmanship and economics, your economical thinking, and I like your philosophy about trust and openness. But the problem is the industry I'm working in is full of very combative, closed, bluffing people. They're all like that. When I meet somebody who comes to me and says something like that, I usually look around to see if I can find a mirror. And if I cannot hold up that mirror in front of the person, and then I say, there you go. Here's your combative, bluffing, closed negotiator. Do you see him or her in here? Because we tend to get the same approach from other people, which we act out ourselves. So if we are combative, if we are closed, if we are bluffing, we have a tendency to generate the same approach from our counterpart in a negotiation. I'm going to wrap up just with the study we did where we were interviewing people from 20 different countries. And one of the questions were obviously, what is the lowest level of trust considered by a foreigner? So that means people from outside these countries. We were asking 20 different countries and they just have to list what countries in the world would we actually put the lowest level of trust on. Russia came up number 1, China 2, Saudi Arabia 3, Brazil 4, and the US, to some people's surprise, actually came in as a number 5. To me, that is not really that surprising because trust level has something to do with we actually really trust other people, and that goes along in negotiations as well. In one of the other classes, one of the other weeks, we're going to look at how can we actually make sure that we can trust somebody without becoming naive. So more about that a little bit later. Another question we did in the same study is the highest level of trust that was actually generated by a foreigner. So that means a person outside of the country being evaluated, obviously. And number 1 in this study was Switzerland, 2 Norway, 3 Finland, 4 England, 5 Denmark, 6 Luxembourg, and number 7 was Sweden. What you might recognize here is that the Nordic countries in the northern part of Europe, Scandinavia, were having the highest ranking on trust. And we're going to talk about that as well a little bit later. Right, just to wrap up, and this is the final part of this video before you have to do your exercise. And if you look at the ethics through self-discipline, there's really 10 commandments of success you can use to try and improve your trust level and your ethics in negotiation. And one of them is this wonderful Nike slogan, just do it. It's really not that complicated, just do it. And I mean, most of us actually have a stomach sensation what is right and wrong. The second thing I've listed here is learn your own rules, know what you want and what you don't want. So don't get intrigued or dependent on other people. Do what you feel has a value to yourself and the people around you. Show responsibility and take ownership. That's a huge one. It's very important that you actually grab that and grab responsibility in a negotiation. Practice, that means just practice whatever needs to be done in order to be more ethical. Eliminate bad habits. And bad habits could be, for instance, bluffing. It could be telling something that is not the absolute truth. It could be holding back information at the wrong time if you are in a partnership negotiation. Set goals and achieve the goals. So that means basically set a focus what you want to achieve and then focus on that. And then a very simple one, do what you said you wanted to do. It's very simple, really. But could you imagine that the whole world was like that? So if we had a worker coming in to do something at our private home on Thursday at 10, he promised to be there on Thursday at 10, and he would always be there on Thursday at 10 o'clock. Wouldn't that be an amazing world? Obviously, the world is not black and white, so that is not always what is happening. And then a truly important one as well is ignore pressure from your surroundings. So if you are in a department or an organization that put pressure on you to do something that we would consider unethical, well, you have to be strong and you might need to resist that as well. And don't give up. Keep your morals and ethics high, even though the world around you doesn't seem to agree with your targets.